What I want to talk to you about today is based on CEMA and my experiences at CEMA, but on a broader issue, and the broader issue is multi-stakeholder organizations, involvement in multi-stakeholder organizations, and the investment that we make into these processes, and whether we really look at these things seriously before we get into them. And I'm basically going to use CEMA as an example. As Al says, I've been doing this for a long time. It's scary to me every time I do this and look at the bit of my information and see that I started in 1971. That makes me old. So a deputy minister a number of years ago said to me, you know what? You know, we have a name for you. And I said, what's that? And he said, you are an optimistic cynic. I thought, okay, what's the definition? The definition, he said, is you're a cynic because you don't believe us very often. The optimism is, but you keep coming back. So I keep coming back and get involved in these processes. So some of you may not know what CEMA is, the Cumulative Environmental Management Association. So bear with me for a few minutes. I'm going to give you some background. So the whole question of cumulative effects management in the oil sands has been around since the 70s, believe it or not, and debated back and forth. And I think everybody was kind of scared of taking on this cat. Nobody wanted to grab the cat by the tail. But in the 90s, the Alberta government and industry realized that they couldn't keep ignoring it. And in 1998, Alberta Environment created the Regional Sustainable Development Strategy, RSDS for short, for the Athabasca oil sands area. They identified 72 environmental issues that should be studied. They also recognized that most of the issues that were faced were neither owned or solved by individuals or any individual stakeholder or vested interest. With the growing interdependence came a growing need to search for collaborative approaches, multi-stakeholder organizations. But this sharing problems, dilemmas, facilitating knowledge exchange, searching for alignment of goals, not an easy task. The development of the oil sands resulted in questions about the ability of the environment to handle the level of projected growth and development. It also resulted in increased stakeholder concern. And a lot of that concern came out of the Aboriginal and the NGO ends of things. And the general public living in the area, the citizens in Fort McMurray and area, you know, really did not understand what was going on around them. They knew that something was happening, but they really wanted to know what was the effect. The cumulative environmental impacts could potentially affect environmental quality, biological diversity, and human health, resulting in habitat loss, wildlife loss, and reduction in air and water quality. So this was the impetus where they came together, government and industry mainly, and formed CEMA in 2000. This group then added Aboriginal and NGO groups to it, and they were given a task of looking at 37 of these RSDS issues. So it became a partnership of industry, Aboriginal groups, non-government organizations, and government agencies at federal, provincial, and local levels. Everybody at the table. And it was a consensus-based organization. That was the design. While reaching consensus was a challenge. Large group, it was time-consuming, but in keeping it as an ideal allowed for more realistic and targeted recommendations, but not an easy task. CEMA's original vision was that the environment of the region, including the land, forest, air, water, wildlife, biodiversity, be protected, sustained, and restored over the long term. Should any impacts be evident, CEMA would recommend, promote, and implement mitigating actions. Its goal was to provide these recommendations directly to the regulators on managing potential cumulative environmental effects using an array of management tools such as environmental limits or thresholds. We hear about thresholds all the time. So it was also in the original vision, it was to be used as a means of promoting dialogue and building consensus, not as a locus of policy implementation and oversight. It was felt that the creation of a management framework allowed these cumulative impacts to be considered, analyzed, and acted upon in a way that optimizes inputs from all these different groups. These have made a significant contribution to the efforts to develop land use plans that strike a balance between development and the environment. And the reports and management plans and management frameworks that CEMA has put are seen all through government policy. You were talking about the wetland policy and the wetland guidelines and things like that. A lot of it is based on CEMA work. So, management frameworks became the tool. CEMA created over a dozen major management frameworks and a number of guidance documents. And in a lot of cases, the guidance documents, the CEMA cover was taken off, a government cover was put on, and it became regulation. But it is challenging putting these things together. Doing it in the context of a multi-stakeholder organization and trying to reach consensus with a number of vested interests in a room, again, not an easy task. There are a lot of barriers that face them. Proper resourcing. How do you pay for this? Poor participation among members because it wasn't a priority. Even organizations like government and industry that had experts, it wasn't always a priority that their expert be at a CEMA meeting. Also, the NGOs and the Aboriginals just did not have the capacity, the horsepower, to really make meaningful inputs into some of the highly technical areas that CEMA got into. And there was a lack of broader social and political legitimacy and difficulty obtaining needed inputs. A lot of times we had to go outside of the province to get the inputs. We couldn't get the inputs from our own member groups. So CEMA was guided by this RSDS, but in 2008, Alberta embarked on a new approach, land use framework, Lower Athabasca regional plans. The RSDS issues were previously identified, provided guidance to CEMA, were now replaced by new regional plans. At the same time, CEMA was going through some growth problems. A number of the members in the Aboriginal and the NGO committees left CEMA through frustration. Their concerns that members of CEMA were participating for the interests of their organization versus for the health and sustainability of the environment. I guess that's what we call a vested interest. Lack of results compared to what was envisioned by the RSDS. Perceived power inequities amongst member groups. Government and industry controlled the agendas. A belief that industry funding of CEMA drives the work that was being done. And these four things I listed came right out of a letter that the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation sent to CEMA when they withdrew from CEMA. So when all this turmoil was going on, 2008, 2010, land use frameworks, CEMA changing the way it operates, and it did change drastically. It went from a consensus-based organization to an organization that was based on 4 caucuses, an Aboriginal caucus, an NGO caucus, an industry caucus, and a government caucus, where all were represented equally at the CEMA board. Sounds great, but as with a lot of solutions, it also creates extra problems. It's like those ads you see on TV where we have this miracle drug and you take it, but the posted side effects, you may die, you have dryness of mouth and headaches, and that's what happens. At that time too, the funders of CEMA started looking at CEMA and saying, is our investment in CEMA really bringing us a return? One of the things that came out was CEMA's original mandate completed? The RSDS was the original mandate, is that done? Well, CEMA's management committee actually commissioned a third-party study to look at the whole question of the 37 issues and found that a number of them were basically half to 3/4 done. They weren't complete. And there were a number of them, although you could call them complete, they required updates on a regular basis. Who was going to do this? The other thing that came up with the creation of new groups in the area, AMERA, the monitoring agency, COSIA, the industry one, was CEMA's work a duplication of what other groups were doing. This was one of the justifications that CAP, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, used in asking the government to widen up the operations of CEMA, that CEMA's work was a duplication. However, when asked, industry reps could not give specifics. CEMA created management frameworks and guidance documents that were forwarded to regulators for their use in implementing final products. No other group in Alberta, never mind Northeastern Alberta, does this. And if they do, it certainly is not at the magnitude that CEMA was doing. The other management tool that came to light about the same time was the Integrated Resource Management System, IRMS. Just in case you're not familiar with it, it was adopted by the Alberta government to basically integrate and align natural resource and environmental policies and provide clear environmental, economic, and social outcomes, and about 16 other criteria. But one of the things that came out of that is the Alberta Environment did a study, an internal study on a number of the multi-stakeholder organizations on whether or not they were compatible with this new integrated management strategy that the government was going to take on. And I have a list of a page and a half of different comments, but I just want to read you the very last one. Through involving the 4 CEMA caucuses, CEMA is able to develop strong, broadly agreed upon recommendations. All recommendations are agreed upon by the board and member concerns with the recommendation detailed. CEMA is able to get a true reading on what policy is needed. The clear agreed upon process in CEMA can help create broadly agreed upon policy in significantly less time. Strong Aboriginal involvement can enhance Aboriginal consultation. CEMA has a non-member participation policy to gain broader input where appropriate, especially encourage participation in Aboriginal communities. Pretty nice, pretty ideal. So in 2014, the government of Alberta got another outside third party to do another assessment of CEMA. I think we had 5 or 6 assessments in the 7 years that I was at CEMA. So this assessment, carried out by a Calgary consultant, learned that the multi-stakeholder organizations are organizations where relationships have been built and a level of trust has been established. These are extremely valuable and should be fostered and grown. The creation of AMERA, JOSM, COSIA, the WPACs in the LARP area has put a cloud over this whole Northeast. What do they all do? But they concluded that there's little overlap amongst these existing regional multi-stakeholder organizations. They concluded that CEMA demonstrated its ability to work through tough issues and deliver products that present multiple perspectives. CEMA can contribute to many of the IRM's functions, and the government of Alberta should work with CEMA to make sure they have the support they need to make a meaningful contribution. Again, pretty glowing, an ideal organization. All of this going on, and the main source of funding of CEMA, of course, was industry, and industry wanted to dissolve CEMA. Didn't make for a very good place to be, a lot of turmoil. But, you know, the path forward with the new government elected last year, where they made the following commitment. We will strengthen environmental standards, inspection, monitoring, and enforcement to protect Alberta's water, land, and air. We will build standards based on independent science and international best practices, designed transparently in careful consultation with Albertans. CEMA was uniquely placed to help the government of Alberta deliver on this objective, and a number of members were optimistic that CEMA would once again thrive under this new provincial regime. However, plans were already in place, and to move faster than the new regime could overcome its naivety. So why is CEMA being terminated? I mean, it's glowing. It's a prime example of what a multi-stakeholder organization should be. Everybody's at the table, they work together, and they actually produce products. Well, it's not something that just happened in the last couple of years. I go back to 2008, a Pembina Institute report called Taking the Wheel, and they reported proceeding with oil sands development rapidly and without proper environmental impact assessment, mitigation, and management is favored by those who benefit from it. These beneficiaries are the oil sands companies and a government that has clearly placed rapid oil sands development before environmental protection through responsible development. This task is easily accomplished through several tactics, including delaying consensus agreements and controlling the amount of financial resources available to CEMA. That's about the same time that Pembina and other NGOs and Aboriginal groups left CEMA. Another assessment done about the same time by a fellow named George Hoberg in a publication called Playing Defense, Early Response to Conflict Expansion in Oil Sands Policy Subsystem. Says that government and industry encourage the legitimacy of a process, the multi-stakeholder process, but do everything to control agenda and outcomes. He pointed out there are more participants in processes, but relatively little change has occurred to policy. A number of CEMA recommendations having cross-sectoral support have been ignored by government. He recommended that the pattern is not consultation for regulation, but consultation instead of regulation. He called this strategy talk and dig. So as I mentioned before, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers in September 2012 asked the government to disband CEMA. Well, we had an unexpected white knight come to the defense of CEMA, and that was the Environment Minister, Diana McQueen. On a couple of her quotes, she says, "When you look at CEMA and the broad stakeholders of that organization, you've got voices of everyone around the table. The way they do consensus-based decision-making is very important. When CEMA completes reports and submits them to government, we know they had a broad stakeholder input and discussion. So for us, we really value the work they do." In the CEMA case, the reorganization where we went from a consensus-based organization where we had a lot of blockers or naysayers that could hold up progress to an organization that had a balanced governance system, it neutralized the overwhelming power of industry and government at the table. And this wasn't acceptable. The other players had more input into setting agenda and priority issues CEMA would address. A number of the newly established priorities, that's post-2010, had low prioritization among the funders and government agencies. It was demonstrated previously that not being able to address priority issues identified by a member leads to a lower value placed on participation, in fact, membership withdrawal. One of the areas the new governance structure approved was CEMA looking into the area of cumulative effects of development on human health. And that was not an easy battle. And it lasted for about a year and a half, and then at a board meeting that was not very well attended, a motion came forward, and government, led by the government of Alberta, to get CEMA out of the human health issues, cease and desist work on it. There was a condition that the Alberta government would report back to CEMA in a very timely fashion on their progress on human health issues. 2 years went by and no report. Another challenge prevalent at CEMA was that members had conflicts of desired outcomes, not incomes, that one too. Participants were tasked with driving initiatives that sought to change institutions and alter the status quo, but some may had a vested interest in preserving the existing state of affairs. Reaching consensus was always a problem, and CEMA's early history was characterized by frequent disagreements resulting in difficulty implementing initiatives in a timely fashion. So CEMA adopted a new formal decision-making process and learned that requiring full consent is especially problematic if there are a large number of members. As more voices there are, the more veto players are present. CEMA was, in the last 5 years of its existence, was negatively affected by irregular funding. And this was viewed by many as a form of control or even punishment. Is it coincidental that this practice emerged after CEMA changed its governance structure? to reflect a more democratic process for all members. Government at the highest levels always came to the support of CEMA until very recently. Was the problem a relatively new deputy minister with a different agenda and a recently appointed environment minister with too much on her plate? In closing, I've been reading a number of publications over my years as executive director in regard to democratic process and networks and multi-stakeholder processes. One of the themes that is prevalent in the academic dealings with this is that entering these processes should be done with a lot of thought. The mere fact of entering such a process can corrupt seriously held principles, as the process treats the views of various stakeholders as equal and that compromise is the only solution. One author claimed that there is a moral hazard in that seriously held, properly non-negotiable principles, such as the belief in a wilderness area, are downgraded to the status of interests on par with more prosaic concerns like profit. If this is a valid concern, then is the multi-stakeholder forum just a subtle form of political control? This would secure the continued dominance of the development imperatives of the state and the market economy. Was CEMA too successful in actually creating a more democratic forum? It's interesting that soon after announcing no further support for CEMA, the Deputy Minister of Environment was in Fort McMurray asking groups to join their new multi-stakeholder organization. CEMA officially closes its doors on April 30th. Thank you.